All right. So I think there probably will be people joining us as we get underway, but I do think we'll try and stick to time. I'm mindful of everybody's time and tremendously grateful that everyone's come to join us on a Wednesday evening in Canberra. And I'd like to start by acknowledging the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people on whose land many of us are today and tonight, and to recognise that that land was never ceded. And to thank our Indigenous leaders, past, present and emerging, for their generosity in sharing knowledge and sharing perspective. And I hope that we are listening and that we can continue to learn. So tonight, we are so grateful that you've come to talk with us about climate action at a community level. I'm aware that we have not got Zali Steggall with us as yet, and I know she's had a very busy day in Parliament, and I know many of you will be aware of that. But for proACT ACT, climate change is a central issue. So for those of you who are not aware of this organisation, we are a group of Canberrans who are very interested in changing how politics is done. We're particularly interested in process and how we can get good quality community engagement. So we're drawing really strongly on the Voices For model coming out of the Cathy McGowan and Helen Haynes heritage out of the federal seat of Indi in Northern Victoria. We want to be an organisation that listens and talks and shares ideas, and we'd very much like this organisation to come behind a good community independent candidate to represent the ACT in the Senate at the next election. So that's a little bit about proACT ACT. If you haven't been part of the organisation and you're interested, we love having members. We're quite keen to host active conversations and getting people talking. What we know from the conversations we've had so far is that climate change is a central issue in the ACT. It's a central issue as we head towards the federal election, which might be this year and probably will be next year. But we know that in Canberra, we care about climate action and we understand the complexities of it. We understand some of the political challenges. We're also really interested when we're talking about climate change at making sure we've got broad, diverse representation and that we try and listen to all elements of our society. And that means people who are older, who are younger, who have different coloured skin, different backgrounds and different perspectives on the challenge. I think the more we listen and the more we talk, the more likely we are to solve these quite complex problems. So thank you again for joining us, everyone. We have two speakers tonight, and we're going to start with our first speaker, Ruby Donald. Ruby is a member of the, I'm going to get there, it's AYCC Canberra part, and she's been active with that organisation now for the last 3 years as a volunteer and as an advocate. She's a student at the Australian National University studying law and environmental science, and she's done quite a lot of work with other community organisations here in Canberra. So welcome, Ruby. I'm really looking forward to hearing what you have to say about community involvement in climate action.
Yeah, thanks so much for organising this webinar tonight. And I also want to acknowledge the Ngunnawal and Ngambri land that I'm on as well, and recognise that sovereignty was never ceded. Yeah, so I thought I would talk about what I know, which is AYCC. AYCC is Australia's largest youth-led climate organisation. And our mission is to build a movement of young people, specifically leading solutions to the climate crisis. In my opinion, the value that's most central to AYCC, and the reason that I volunteered for this long, is because of the justice lens that AYCC has. We think that climate change is a symptom of deeper injustices and that the root cause is colonial and capitalist systems and structures. And because of that, we think that our struggle is deeply intertwined with Indigenous justice and self-determination and various other social justice movements. And we want climate justice, not just because it helps us build the future that we want to inherit, but also we think that it's critical for tackling the climate crisis at the speed that is required. And so the reason that we are a youth-led organisation specifically as well is because it is young people who will inherit the consequences of decisions made today. And throughout history, young people have demonstrated how we have the creativity and passion and innovation to lead social justice movements. And so AYCC has a really strong focus on targeting governments and corporations, because when you do look at what contributes the most to the climate change, it is overwhelmingly burning fossil fuels. And so we think that, even if individuals do take their own action and ride their bike to work and turn off their lights, we still can't control the billions of tons of fossil fuels being burned or exported. And so we see governments and corporations as having the most power to make change. And the way we do that in our communities across Australia is through building a movement of young people to put pressure on those governments and corporations by having conversations in our communities and providing opportunities to educate and upskill our volunteers, and be a really grassroots from the bottom up kind of structured organisation. And then by using that movement of young people, we protest and negotiate with those in power with the pressure that we have. And so some of the past campaigns that AYCC has been involved in are things like, for example, the banks campaign a few years ago, where we got the 4 major banks to rule out funding Adani by talking to customers and staff and informing the public about what kind of deals these banks were getting into. A few years ago as well, we also got GHD, which is a contractor, to rule out building Adani's railway, which involved a lot of mornings in Canberra protesting and getting to know their security outside of their building. AYCC in Cairns recently just won a campaign to secure $2 billion for renewable energy in rural Queensland. And some other ones that we've been involved in are things like the Don't Frack the NT campaign to stop Origin Energy fracking in the Northern Territory. Or most recently, we put our efforts behind trying to secure more money for renewables in the federal budget, which involved actions like trying to target Josh Frydenberg himself and spelling out "Fund Our Future, Not Gas" on the lawns of Parliament on the night of the budget. So a lot of our actions include things like protesting outside of corporation buildings, brand jamming, where we ruin the reputations of fossil fuel aligned corporations, or even just talking to politicians about our experiences and demands. And we found that because we're such a large organisation with volunteers all over Australia, we can have a really big impact on corporations and politicians. So at the moment, we are leading up to campaigning around the federal budget, the federal election. Because we are political but non-partisan, that means that we recognise that climate change is inherently political, but we don't support one party. So we'll be doing things like having conversations in our community around voting for climate and putting pressure on politicians to have more ambitious climate policy. And of course, we've also got a COP26 coming up next week. So we're planning on doing, putting a lot of pressure on Scott Morrison around that. We have a plan to do a screening on the Parliament lawns on the 5th of a video we've made of young people all across Australia talking about what climate solutions look like in their communities. And we'll be following that by trying to send that and get the attention of some strategic politicians. So if you're interested in that, all ages are welcome. And if you're in between the ages of 13 and 30 and are interested in campaigning or getting involved in activism with AYCC, all the info for everything I've said is on our Facebook, Instagram, and website. And that's pretty much a rundown of what AYCC is and what we stand for and what activism looks like for young people in our community.
Ruby, thank you so much for that. I know many people who are with us tonight are aware of the impact that the Youth Voice has had in climate action. The work that you guys do is inspiring and certainly helps me in the work that I do trying to advocate as well. So thank you so much for joining us and for giving us that overview. I'd like to now welcome Zali Steggall. Zali, thank you so much for joining us. We know you've had a really busy day, and thank you for tabling the bill or attempting to have it discussed. For those of you who don't know Zali Steggall, Zali's the MP for Warringah. She was elected in 2019, replacing a former Prime Minister as an independent who represents her community strongly. She's been an extraordinary advocate for climate action over the last 2 years, and I know many of us are so grateful for the work that you do, Zali. So it's great that you could spend some time with us this evening. We're very grateful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. No, well, look, it's good. It's good to listen, to hear the passion, and you know, it's good to, obviously we always need to have more conversations, get more people involved, but in particular get young people involved, because Look, the great thing about the Australian system is that we have a compulsory vote, but your vote is really worthless if you don't apply it meaningfully. So it really is important to think, you know, when it comes time to vote, inform yourself, make sure you've registered to vote. For young people, incredibly important, but also to be aware of policies and issues. And, you know, it's really good to question and to participate in democracy. One of the things independents, I think, are very focused on is that participatory model where, you know, letting communities know about, you know, where there's opportunities for making submissions, when there's inquiries, what is being debated and legislated in the House, so that you actually get involved, because, you know, we've got big questions, we have big challenges ahead. And if you're sitting on the sidelines, just means other people are making the decisions on your behalf. So, yes, it's been a big day on climate, I have to say. So, look, disappointing, but not surprising. We've seen a lot of, you know, look, the government came out with their pseudo plan yesterday. I would call it the un-Australian way, because it's essentially a cop-out of not really doing anything, the same policies, the same technologies, with the hope and a prayer that down the road we will have some way of offsetting it. It's still not a transition plan in terms of giving some certainty for investors, but also some certainty for communities that know they're going to be impacted with transition to clean technologies and actually want a plan. They want an investment from a point of view of retraining, of opportunities, what technologies will come and be deployed in their region, you know, what it's going to look like. And what we got was a 15-page slideshow. So, yes, try to get on debate. We need to lock it in. I think our long-term climate policy shouldn't be at the whim of certain MPs, in particular national MPs. So it really needs to, if we lock it into law, it means that regardless of who is in government, successfully, you know, our long-term plan is going to traverse about 10 elections. So you're going to have a number of governments. And so if we lock it into law, it means that we have a clear framework that each government, whoever is in power, has to comply with and has to keep progressing. I think that's incredibly important.
Zali, the Climate Act, the bill that you've designed to help Australian politics contend with the toxicity of climate change, could you take those of us who haven't spent time looking at it through what you're trying to achieve with that bill?
Sure. Well, look, I mean, I don't consider myself a politician. I came into politics to try and put a sensible solution forward, actually, to cut through the political football, you know, the partisan wars we've had over this for over 15 years now. Yeah. It's modelled on the UK's approach. So what it is rather than getting into the weeds and getting technology specific, it's actually creating the framework. So locking into law that we need to get to net zero by 2050 or sooner. There is a mechanism to listen to the science and bring that date forward, but to do so with regular 5-year emission reduction budgets. Now, that's incredibly important because obviously decisions and projects take time. There is a planning process. There's a, you know, where you have to work out the model, work out the finances of it, and then there is a delivery time, and then it needs to get up and running. So by having 5-year emission reduction budgets, we can set the objective for each 5-year period, and we can ensure that we get to that net zero in as efficient a way possible, in looking at what sector is ready to move. You know, there are certain sectors that are ready now, like energy and transport. Other sectors are more difficult, and so they are prioritised in later budgets. We also need to make sure we do it fiscally responsibly, right? Because we know that if we leave all the action to later, it will cost a lot more and actually won't achieve the outcomes necessary. So the bill focuses in its objects and principles on very important guiding principles like generational equity. We don't want to leave it all up to the later generations to have to bear the cost. We need to make sure we have regional equity, you know, that not one region is made to bear the cost of transition above any other. We need to make sure our First Nations, you know, our Indigenous people are around the table, that regional development is around the table. So making sure we have a cohesive, collaborative approach to the transition. And I would argue not what we have at the moment, which is secret deals. The other aspect of the bill that's incredibly important is it is empowering a climate change commission to advise government and to monitor progress, because, and we've seen this with COVID, the importance of experts, you know, in terms of sitting outside of government that can advise. I liken it to the Reserve Bank. It is a system that works because it allows us to have a non-partisan advice on how we can best achieve the outcomes we need to do. So, and it is a model that's been proven to work. The UK has had such legislation since 2008. And in fact, there, they see having a Climate Change Commission, which is an independent, expert-based commission, as actually their political insurance, because it means that the decisions the government takes usually, and they've been able to do it in a bipartisan way, is on the basis of the advice of the commission. And so it doesn't carry the same political responsibility. It's probably not the right way to describe it, but it's not the same political kind of risk because it is on the advice of the commission. And so it's like an insurance policy to the government of the day and the opposition that is how you can go about it. Now, the other aspect that the bill really focuses on, and I think is incredibly important, is our risk assessment around the country. We are incredibly exposed in a number of ways, you know, whether it's our environmental risk, our health, economic development, you know, and then obviously the environmental aspects from coastal erosion and drought. We simply don't have that work being done because if the government is wanting to downplay the risk global warming is posing to us, they are certainly not going to also prepare for those risks. So they're completely underplaying that aspect, and we need to get ready. We saw in the 2019 bushfires how underprepared we were. We had the warnings of ex-fire chiefs had been trying to warn, and no one was prepared to listen to them. We can't let that happen ever again. And then, of course, we need to adapt. So, unfortunately, the sad reality is we have a certain amount of global warming that's baked into the system. And as if we can take some very strong action now, we can avert the worst. But as the UN emissions gap report that came out today shows, on current pledges, we're on track for 2.7 degrees of warming. So not good news. We can bring that down by about half a degree to about 2.2 with about the net zero by 2050. But obviously, the more action we take early, the better it will be. But we are unfortunately already baked in pretty much to be over the 1.5 degrees. So what that does mean is we need to seriously talk about adaptation in terms of, you know, how we build, where we live, our relationship with the environment, how communities are going to cope. We also know a transition is underway, so we know there is going to be a change of workforce and economies for certain communities. So communities that have traditionally relied on thermal coal and thermal, coal generated power, and that there are areas of mining will continue to do well, but some areas of mining around fossil fuels we will transition away. And so the question is, how do those communities prepare? That is all part of the adaptation piece that the climate change bills takes into account. Now, we've had an inquiry. We had a number of submissions made. It has the overwhelming support from business to industry to unions to environmental groups and from, the population at large, which I think is probably the most important. A lot of feedback in relation to some of the technicalities of the bill, but also around wanting to put in an interim target. Now, my resistance to that was that in some ways usurps the role of the Commission to advise on what 5-year emission reduction budgets should be. So those 5-year budgets essentially create the interim target. But in light of the IPCC report this year and where we're at, I think it is important that we have in the objects and the guidelines of the bill that the interim target needs to be ambitious. Now, we know that we've already used up 85% of world global carbon budgets. And so we need meaningful reductions by 2030. So I have put as a goal that we reach 60% emissions by 2030. We need to say it's a very at the minimum, we need to reach the 50% emissions reductions. We have the technology to achieve between 50 and 60. It would be a stretch to go much above, but again, technology is improving at dramatic pace. cost is deflating really fast, and so that is encouraging transition. If the government could actually put in place the laws and the legislation that create the right legislative environment, it drives investment, it will drive that uptake in technology, which can then accelerate the transition. So it's interesting when I listen to AYCC that, you know, from a youth point of view, it's always, you know, it is important to legislate because laws do provide the certainty and the framework that ultimately the private sector needs to make these investments. You know, when a superannuation company is looking at what its investment pathway for the next 30 years is going to be, they want to know that that is, you know, they've got long-term visibility, that is a sound investment over 30 years.
Mm. Look, it's a great overview, and I remember, you know, the first time I started to look at the bill that you designed a couple of years ago, impressed by a number of different elements of it, and particularly this structural attempt to depoliticize, putting the control in scientists and people who are independent from government. And then that tremendous importance of being able to talk about and simply being able to acknowledge the extraordinary need for Australians to begin a process of adaptation. A couple of months ago, proACT hosted a webinar with Will Steffen, and we were reflecting on the IPCC report. And really, you know, 1.6 degrees is the best case scenario if we decarbonise everything right now. And so we do have quite a lot, and that's by 2040. So we do have a lot of work to do. Ruby, I'd actually really like to hear your thoughts on where our politicians are at, and when you look towards Parliament House, when you listen to Zali explaining the work that she's done, and then you see the challenges that she comes up against in terms of our politics. What are your thoughts on how well we're doing?
That is a good question. In my perspective, as somebody who's not a politician, it is really frustrating to look at Parliament. I think from multiple perspectives, partly because, you know, the LNP is not doing anything, but also partly because the people who are out there doing good things are up against a big fight. And, you know, I can tell that they're trying hard and they're getting pushed back as well. Yeah, politics seems like very bureaucratic to me, and it seems like there are a lot of internal, I guess, dynamics going on in between parties as well. And yeah, I think that from my perspective, the most important thing I think that we need is more independent and well-intentioned politicians. And for there to be like as little outward influence and political donations as possible, because I think that personally that is the biggest barrier towards seeing real climate action from our politicians. And, you know, it's preventing even, you know, well-intentioned politicians from getting anywhere sometimes.
Zali, I don't know if you wanted to think about it. We also hosted a screening of The Big Deal and had Craig Rucastle and Richard Dennis join us for discussing that a couple of weeks ago. And so the proACT organisation's been thinking a lot about financial integrity in politics and the challenges that might be faced. Do you think it's the independent route which will help us to detoxify the climate politics in Australia?
Look, I think so. I'm a little bit cynical with the major parties, and that's probably why I'm an independent, because essentially as soon as they're in power, they don't do the things they kind of complained or do anything about the things they complained about in opposition. So, you know, I think ultimately that governance agenda really is driven by the crossbench, and it's only every time the crossbench has balance of power that we actually get progress on transparency measures. So it was under the Gillard minority government that we introduced actually, you know, the budgetary office and the review of the budget, the Auditor General. So they're all aspects that we can increase it incrementally. And I certainly have a long list of things I would like to change hopefully after the next election, with holding the balance of power from an independent crossbench point of view. Yeah, look, the Big Deal movie is incredibly important. Ruby, your generation needs to watch that to know just, I mean, it is shocking the influence it has. I think as we get older, we get a little bit less shocked, which is not good. And I think for too long, people have thought that politics is this dirty game that's over, you know, that's sort of something you don't get involved with, that you probably pay attention to every 3 years when you have to vote. You don't like them, you know, trust in politicians is really low. It's seen as this really negative, you know, adversarial environment. But we need to change that. By staying, that is what the status quo, and the major parties want you to think of politics because they want to keep you out of politics. They don't want you to get involved. And you can, I mean, now there are so many ways to get involved in politics and to get, you know, not accept the status quo and be, you know, really get involved to change it. I've seen some research that shows that young women 18 to 25, 0% wanted to get into politics. And I thought that was just horrible, because if you're not at the decision-making table, these decisions are going to be made about you and impact your life, and you are not going to have a say. So it's crazy to think that people are not, you know, young people need to get involved in wanting a career in politics, become a politician. Look, as an independent, it's an incredibly good career. I'm really enjoying it. It's incredibly stimulating. So if I could say to everyone watching is, please think about getting involved. So obviously this is a great, you know, forum to discuss, but also getting involved is really important. But yeah, look, donation laws need to be changed. We need more transparency. Truth in political advertising, introduced legislation this Monday around, we have no legislation that says that you can't lie in advertising around an election. So whereas in business, in commerce, you can't lie about what a product, you know, that you're selling or a service you're doing, there is nothing like that in politics. It's crazy, and it's overwhelmingly people support that we should legislate it. But obviously the major parties, they have no incentive to do it because they like taking advantage of the situation. At each election we see, you know, the slinging match and the lies that get just published. So really important to push behind that and question it. We've had introduced legislation around changing the Spam Act because everyone's been getting spammed with UAP messages. Yeah, we need a Federal Integrity Commission. I mean, that's the overwhelming requirement at the moment. There are a number of scandals that we're just, you know, this has not been a good parliament. The 46th parliament under Scott Morrison has been horrendous. I think for transparency, he really has promoted within his departments and his heads, you know, a systemic process of hiding documents, of objecting to freedom of information requests, of, you know, there is no transparency or accountability under Scott Morrison as Prime Minister. So that's, you know, I think that's an urgent thing we need to address. It's something that doesn't sit comfortably with many backbench MPs, but they are just never willing to do anything. So the number one thing voters can do is go to your MP and ask for their record, you know, actually hold them to task on what have they personally done. You know, it's not good enough to just hide behind the collective of what a party does. You actually have to ask them, you know, what is their contribution on behalf of you? You know, they are representing you. It's a privilege, not a right, to be in Parliament.
It always strikes me as I, you know, go past Parliament House on my way to work every day, and I look at and I know many of us will find ourselves shaking our arm at it, going, you know, those guys need to do better. And I think it's time for us to take some of that power back to our community level, to both take responsibility for how we vote, and that includes not just being friends with your local MP, but also understanding how that local MP has voted on some of the key issues that are of importance, but also being engaged, you know, actually being a participant in democracy. That's a choice that we make, and I think we can change politics by fostering much better community engagement. It's a great discussion from our two panelists so far, and I do want to get some of the questions that I can see both in the chat and in the Q&A, and I'll try and balance between the two. Look, we're all, I think, aware of the need to rapidly decarbonise the Australian economy, and particularly when you look at the IPCC report and you see how the importance of action in the next decade or so. Zali, could I ask you what you think is the most complex part of our Australian economy to decarbonise or to shift to net zero? And you might like to start with suggesting that the federal government is the most difficult part, but there might be other areas that I'm missing.
Our biggest block is the National Party, but, and a handful of very powerful donors that have a vested interest in not facilitating a transition. Look, I think we have great opportunity around the energy sector, obviously, because we have so much natural resources, and the deflationary cost of renewable power has just, it's caught experts by surprise just how far the prices come down. So there is huge opportunity there. And we're seeing state governments get on board and get more proactive. Federal government is still nowhere to be seen. We are still funding, so your taxes are still funding fossil fuels at a rate of 80-1 for investment in renewables. So we're nowhere near where we have to be. So we have the opportunity. There is a huge amount of investment going around the world, especially by about 2025. There's about $65 billion worth of investment up for grabs for jurisdictions that have the right policies in place. So they're the easiest ones to do. And transport, I mean, it is crazy. We have no local manufacturing in Australia. We lost all that, right? So we are going to be dependent on the cars we import, and we are going to get the worst cars in the world because we have the lowest emission standards and fuel standards for our vehicles, and we have no incentives around transitioning to EVs, whether it's from a tax point of view for corporate fleets, the luxury car tax on vehicles, there's just nothing there. I mean, even the state government in Victoria is introducing a road tax, which is a disincentive from uptake of EVs. So it's really questionable in that sense. It's a massive shortfall in the policy. There's no reason why not. We're not an oil-rich country. We import our fuel. There's no reason why we are not embracing an EV strategy. There's a hard sector. Look, around the energy, the concern, though, is that loss of export revenue, right? There's no point in ignoring the fact that a huge amount of Australia's wealth has been built on our mining and those export revenues. But what we know is that transition is happening whether we like it or not, right? Our trading partners have all made commitments to move away from fossil fuels, and they'll move away from thermal coal. Gas, not quite as quickly. We need to encourage that transition to occur faster, but it is happening. So we are going to lose those markets, and we need to replace them with new ones. And that's obviously what good legislation can do. Areas like agriculture and industry and manufacturing, they are already hard, but there are really amazing people around the world that are working on those sectors. Like, obviously, you're hearing a lot about hydrogen. We need to make the distinction. It's green hydrogen. Anything else is smoke screen and mirrors. You can't magically make it low emission by having carbon capture and storage, because that hasn't proved to work already with billions of dollars invested. But look, there is still areas that are harder to abate, but those areas are moving quickly. We've seen I think it was recently that the World Cement Association has committed, to transitioning to low emission cement. So people are applying their minds to finding the solutions. They are coming. But what we need to do is embrace the low-hanging fruit. And the low-hanging fruit is our energy sector and our transport. So that just, that's where the opportunities are.
Yeah, that's great. I suspect all areas are really interesting. I remember having a meeting with the refrigeration industry representatives a couple of years ago because of the work that I do on the health impacts of heat waves. And industries that might make money out of this are actually tremendously concerned, I think, in the long term about what is going on and what role they can play in ensuring our future.
I should Ruby, say also, I was going to say, construction's a really interesting one. So if you think about, I've been told that 50% of our built landscape, so of what will be built by 2050 is going to be built between now and then, right? So it will be new construction, and yet we still don't have building codes that ensure sustainability, heat efficiency, you know, thermal mass construction, use of low emission technologies. We need to get away from having gas as part of construction, you know, connections. We need to have, you know, double glazing, you know, architecture that is environment specific. All these things can be done relatively simply, but they're simply not done at the moment. Sorry.
Just for the record, transitioning to electric vehicles and moving away from the burning of fossil fuels in our cities and the architecture and the built environment that we can create, you know, it has a tremendous health benefit. So it decreases things like cardiovascular disease. So there's all these tremendous advantages to us looking into the future and really planning, I think, proactively. Ruby, I wanted to ask you about your experience. You mentioned that AYCC has done some really effective advocacy work, and I know many of us have seen and watched that. What sort of conversations have you had with people where you've been worried about their capacity to change? Have you had interesting conversations with politicians? What sort of questions have you come up against?
Yeah, I think that I've definitely had some interesting conversations with politicians, and it varies pretty wildly. I think that, unfortunately, like undeniably, as young people, we often get a bit patronized by politicians time and time again. And then, of course, you know, going up against politicians, or speaking with politicians who are anti-climate action is not always fruitful or enjoyable, I suppose. But I think that there are a lot of politicians out there who are really sympathetic to our cause and actually really willing to engage with us, because at the end of the day, I think often we're coming from a place of we are your community and we're the future of this community in Australia, and these are our experiences and our demands, and often they are quite receptive to that. And so I think that you know, we've built some really good connections with a lot of politicians, and I'm really thankful that I have been able to meet with some politicians as well who I really respect and look up to. So overall, I would say like the response is actually quite useful. But again, like we were saying earlier, sometimes they are restricted in what they can do. But like, for example, I mentioned that AYCC and Cairns won their campaign in Queensland to secured $2 billion for renewable energy. And that was largely because of talking to local politicians and telling them what the community wanted and relaying that message. So it's definitely effective.
Yep. It might be a good opportunity just to ask both of you about the recent federal court decision about Susan Lay's responsibility to younger generations. Zali, can we see hope for change in that decision in terms of the government and the way in which they take responsibility for climate action?
Oh, I wish I could say yes, but I don't think so. Look, it was a great decision. I think it was very brave action and really needed, and they are cumulative. So what we are seeing is more and more legal actions coming out, recognising climate risk, recognising the need for decision makers to take it into account, right? We've seen that with superannuation and now the Susan Lee's case. So that is good. Has she embraced it in the intent of the judgment? No, because at the moment, look, on one hand, she's appealing it, and on the other, in her recent decisions, I mean, in the last month, there's been, I think, 3 or 4 new coal mines approved. So, and in each one, she has referred to the duty as elaborated in the judgment and said that, you know, use the excuse of if it wasn't from us, it would be somewhere else, and so we are not having a meaningful impact or not impacting that duty of care. So they are finding the runarounds from that duty imposed as well as challenging it. So is it going to lead to a change? No. I think maybe I'm getting cynical 2.5 years into this place, but I think ultimately the one thing that does drive MPs in this place is they want to keep their job. right? They want to get re-elected. And so the difficulty in the major parties is that they also then have a dual master, which is the pre-selection process. So they have to toe the line, whether it's Labor or Liberal or National, they toe the line for the sake of their pre-selection. They don't ruffle feathers. They want to go up the, you know, they want to get promoted. They want to make it to front bench. And so there's a real, I think, conflict of interest between maybe the values and integrity they take into the role, you know, when they get into politics, and then the reality of being in there. But at the end of the day, regardless of pre-selection and parties and all of that, they need their community to vote for them. People have to be okay with their stance. And I would argue that it's not good enough to look at the overall umbrella of a party, you know, that the collective does not excuse the individual actions. And so an MP should have that individual responsibility in Parliament of how they vote. And that, you know, I see in the comments as, you know, a lot of both sides and, you know, look, both sides need to take into account. There's no doubt that Labor has been stronger and put forward more genuine policies around commitments to emissions reductions, but is still supporting expansion of fossil fuels. We have to be really clear about what is happening. You know, I've moved amendments to try and stop the fracking for gas of the Beetaloo Basin, and both the Coalition and Labor supported that and voted for that, right? So we have to hold them to account. It's not good enough to have the big mission statement. The individual actions matter. And what I've observed is, most MPs worry about their job. So you have to, you know, you have to vote one climate. That it's got to be that, and you have to really, you know, hold them to that vote and follow what they do. Unless they're a first-term MP, you know, follow what they do. So when you get to the next election, and you have another election coming in 6 months, so it's not long to go, look at their record. What have they and haven't they done? Get an explanation on what they're doing.
No, we do. We have some really impressive MPs on both sides of politics in our parliament. But actually, the Beetaloo Basin is the thing that I come back to regularly. That both parties are supporting fracking, the expansion of our gas industry in the Northern Territory. There are all sorts of issues around that, and the carbon pollution is one dominant problem there. So, you know, as we go into the next election, that has to be up for discussion, I think, regardless of who you're planning to vote for. There are a few other things. We've got about 15 minutes left of conversation, and I'm mindful of the time tonight. I did want to get our speakers' thoughts on what's it called, the Australian way. So Scott Morrison has put forward a model for net zero by 2050. I won't say what I think. Ruby, did you have a chance to have a look at what our federal government's response to climate action is, and what are your initial thoughts?
Yeah, they're not very good. I did read about Scott Morrison's 2050 targets, and a lot of anger and frustration was my initial response, not just because 2050 is not in line with any science based on how we need to be acting on climate change. It's really disrespectful to people already facing the impacts of climate change, you know, who have been for years, to say that we can wait another 2 decades to take action when people, you know, are already losing their lives because of climate change. But also, I think that it was really transparently sort of just to quell the criticism with COP26, because like Zali mentioned a little bit earlier, it's not legislated, is it? So there's really no pressure for the federal government to even follow through with these 2050 targets. And in all reality, you know, I think if I'm correct, there are a lot of coal mines, especially in coal, but probably gas as well, which are probably going to be closed by 2050 anyway, because we've just run out of using these like finite resources. So the government really is going to get away with doing absolutely nothing and putting no action in and just letting these coal mines close on their own. And it's really disrespectful to, I think, myself as a young person who's going to inherit the consequences of that response, but also to people who are already suffering climate impacts, like I said.
Yeah, so all of us who lived through Black Summer have had the impacts of climate change on our health and well-being. You know, the idea that we can defer this for another 30 years is laughable. I wasn't going to give my opinion. Zali, Can you give us your takeaway message on this fantastic document?
Well, I thought it was remarkably un-Australian is all I could say. Having been someone who, I'm proud of Australia. I represent Australia at the Olympics. I think, we are capable of great things. We also have a lot of things we need to reconcile with. But I think it is absolutely un-Australian what was presented yesterday. It was a slideshow, and with a backing up about 129-page document that had nothing. It had no modelling. And let's be clear, it had no new policy. It was a rehash. It was basically saying we're going to commit to net zero by 2050, but we will continue with business as usual, in the hope that down the track, about 50% of the emissions planned will come from developments around the world, other technologies that we don't yet know where they are, and carbon capture and storage, which we know doesn't work. So it was basically, it was crazy. And I'm really curious to listen, to hear, does that work? Because the biggest fear we have is that this is a massive greenwashing exercise from the coalition that's coming, right? In estimates today, or yesterday I think it was, they revealed that they're spending about 30 million on a campaign around a website called Positive Energy. So Ruby, check it out. It is an absolute load of rubbish, right? It is a greenwashing, gaslighting exercise where they are taking credit for emissions that have been achieved through state government legislation like stopping land clearing, nothing that really, or renewable uptake, which is what individuals are doing. I think Australians individually are doing the heavy lifting. I think state governments are doing a fair bit. There's still more to be done, and federal government is just nowhere near it. And yet they are going to greenwash this. They are going to gaslight people and make out that it's good. You only have to listen to government members. They've got their talking points, and they are talking it up for all it's worth. And a lot of people aren't paying attention, and they will hear these messages. They will get repeated and repeated and repeated, and then they will think it's true, and they will go to this website, and this website looks like it's a fair dinkum kind of, approach to emissions reduction, but it is just marketing. And so it's really important to cut through that, really test the case of what's being put to you. So no, sadly, we didn't have anything really of substance announced yesterday. The commitment to net zero by 2050, look, that's a given, in that as soon as we signed on to the Paris Agreement, we signed on as a nation to limit global warming to under 2 degrees and as close to 1.5 as possible. And in fact, we signed on to come every 5 years at the COP events with our most ambitious emission reduction updated plan. That is part of the requirement of the Paris Agreement. And we are not doing that. We are failing to do that because the Prime Minister is not intending to take any updated interim target to 2030 to COP26. And we know that's the main conversation that will be had. So, incredibly disappointed. Question time was interesting today. The Prime Minister revealed that Treasury is currently modelling the cost of their proposal. Now, the irony is there is no detail in the proposal, so I'm not quite sure how Treasury is modelling it, but we will at some point, he says in the next couple of weeks, get some indication of cost. But at the end of the day, the real sting in the tail of what's happened is it's a secret deal with the Nationals. We know there's going to be massive pork barrelling before the next election. So they are going to throw huge amounts of public money to keeping Barnaby Joyce and co happy, basically.
I'm afraid yesterday's announcement I still feel slightly sick, and it's really inspired me to continue working in advocacy fields. Ruby, is that your impression as well? About inspiring us to work collectively? Do you think we can change the minds of our politicians?
Yeah, I do. I think that it's really easy to get bogged down in the climate anxiety and the fatigue of just seeing so much bad climate news. But I also think that we don't really have an option rather than to keep advocating, especially at a time like this when it is so critical that we see climate justice now. And I think that we can absolutely change the mind of politicians, because there have been so many climate justice movements throughout history that have been won by young people, by marginalized people, and they have done that and changed the mind of the public and the majority and of politicians. And we've also done so much to get here as well, and to get to the place where we are talking about 2030 targets.
Yep.
We've come a long way even in 10 years. So I definitely think that we can change the mind of politicians. It's just going to take a little bit more.
I'm going to ask that question that Michael White asked about media and about how we change the national narrative. And, you know, Zali's just given us a beautiful example of the way in which our politicians try to frame our national narrative and the ways in which we might be able to counter that. What's your thought, Ruby, on the News Corp and the way in which we engage with media and who have narratives that we don't always agree with?
Yeah, that's a good question. And I feel a lot of scattered thoughts about this. First of all, I think that Murdoch media is extremely damaging to the Australian public, because it's another example, I think, of corporate influence and bribery, and it's just not independent or based in any fact or science. And it's really worrying to me to see what kind of influence it has over Australia. And I think the first part of your question about, yes, using media to our advantage, I think that we need to combat that with more representation in our media. We need Indigenous people and marginalised people and people of colour and people on the front lines of the climate justice fight to be standing at the front lines of our media and our public and sharing, like, their narrative being the first thing that we see, because they're fighting the hardest battle. And I think that the kind of climate justice that we want and the kind of narrative that we want to shape, you know, inherently has to have its people leading the fight. So I do think that getting rid of Murdoch media is pretty tied to getting rid of, like, corporate donations and just the corruption that happens in politics. And I think it needs to be paired with, like, uplifting more marginalized voices.
That's a really powerful message, I think, on media and voice and how we use it. Zali, what are your thoughts on how we can use media effectively to try and get in a good quality climate debate and good quality climate information?
Yeah, look, obviously media ownership, you know, laws in Australia are really bad. They've concentrated too much power in too few media outlets, and we've had concerted attack on our national broadcaster, so that makes it very difficult, right? Yeah, Murdoch media has been incredibly damaging for climate action, led by someone who doesn't accept climate science. So that is very much been their agenda, and they've been incredibly destructive, and they've really misled the public on a lot of facts, and you know, failed to really do the role that the fourth estate should have, which is hold to account and test what government is doing, and what is being done on behalf of people. So hugely damaging. There's been this change of position, I would say, in the last few weeks, and this commitment to, you know, a bit more climate facts. Where has it come from? Look, a lot of people are asking that. We're not quite sure. Is it genuine? I don't really believe it is. Personally, I could only think it's genuine once they really, truly, for example, have the headlines of there can be no new coal or gas, right? Yeah. To be consistent with a concern around global warming. At least by having shifted, they are making it more possible for the coalition to shift, because they have very much been the coalition masters in terms of what they do. So if I have to think, is there some net gain for us as a population? There is, so that is good. I think a lot of it could also be coming from people are aware, you know, the campaigns around a lot of News Limited, you know, some of our shock jock radio stations, you know, where you end up boycotting the advertisers, getting pressure from consumers about advertising and supporting those platforms is incredibly powerful. And everyone should always remember, you have power as consumers, you have power over brands, over what they do, who they spend money with and supporting. And so ultimately, a lot of these organisations are driven by profit. And so, you know, a collective action that impacts that is powerful. So, you know, I think that is the power of all the individuals, but also having the conversation with you know, your older people, family, friends, your network, you know, pulling, you know, going beyond just your circle to bringing, you know, you have to seek to understand why are not other people not focused on these issues.
It sounds like a kitchen table conversation.
It
sounds
is.
like what we're trying to achieve with proACT, which is about fostering discussions across political divides and trying to bring people together towards a common vision that actually makes a better future for us all. That's going to be the last question for tonight, is asking both Ruby and Zali about the role of the community voice in climate action. We are facing a federal election at some point in the next 6 months. And I guess for many of us, a worst case scenario would be to elect a government again that will fail again to act again on climate change. But we may be in a position where that happens. How much control can we take to a community level? How much influence can we show from community and grassroots organisations? Can we change the world without the federal government? Who'd like to go first?
I don't mind, Ruby.
It's only a small question.
It's not, that's a big one, but I believe every movement and every change throughout history has gradually built up to a point where you have a tipping point. And at some point, and usually you don't know you've reached a tipping point until all of a sudden you're there. And I do think globally we are at that, you know, we are on an accelerating curve towards disruption, and we are going to get there. So this is not a fight that anyone can quit, because the alternative is unimaginable. So it is about constantly regrouping and finding new ways. So I think with an election coming, you have to make your vote count and make sure that everyone you know is making their vote count as much as possible, understanding what their priorities are, making sure you're aware of the system. You know, you want to make sure it's not an informal vote. Who are the options? And you've got both votes, the Senate vote and the House of Reps vote, slightly different, but obviously, you know, opportunities to put different choices. And I strongly believe it's community independence that can make the difference, because we're directly answerable to our communities at the end of the day.
Yep. It's that relationship between community and candidate. You know, it can't be, well, some great candidates on their own, but the ideal model will be a really deeply engaged community candidate. Ruby, how are we going to change the world without the federal government? What do you reckon?
I believe so strongly in the power of collective action. I've said it before, but so many massive fights for social change have been won through collective action by the people who have the most at stakes, like queer social justice movements, racial social justice movements. They've all been won by people who are marginalized and on the front lines. And, you know, we are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Or we are affected by the climate crisis. And I think that climate action is the only way that we're going to see change, because not only like Zali said, do we have the power at the polls to vote in who we want, but also we have the power to protest against those who are in government, to hold them accountable and make sure that no matter who is in government, they are listening to us and taking strong climate action and making sure we're seeing climate justice. So I think, honestly, collective action and community building is the only way that we are going to see climate justice.
Zali, Steggall, Ruby Donald, it's been such a pleasure speaking with the two of you tonight. I feel much better after yesterday's policy release. I feel inspired for hope and for change and for working together with our community. And I think the last word tonight is that our vote counts and we should use it wisely. So thank you so much again for joining us. Thank you everybody in the audience. We're really grateful for the time that you've had with us tonight. And we'd be grateful if you want to continue to work and to be part of the proACT movement here in the ACT. So thank you very much.